Finally, clustering the portal. If you have done the HA proxy exercise, then I can attest, yes, it works. If you have been a little bit greedy and went a step ahead, it might not, you might have run into an issue because HA proxy doesn't start yet. We have configured it to proxy between Tomcat 1 and Tomcat 2. So it's kind of expected that it doesn't run because it can't find all of the Tomcat instances because we didn't cluster them yet and we only have one. We only have Liferay Tomcat 1. And in wise foresight, we have already named Liferay Tomcat 1 Liferay Tomcat 1 because, you can guess it, there's a second one coming up. We will need all of our nodes, all of our individual Liferay servers or Tomcat servers to talk to each other. For one reason, I told you they cache some data, and whenever you change an object on one server, you also want to change it, or you want to make the other server aware that this object changed, and it can just discard the object. Next time it accesses, it reloads from the database, and both have the same cache in their memory. Now, in order to talk to each other, I can tell you this is actually one of the easiest things that we can do, because we are going to activate a component named cluster link. Cluster link will take care of almost everything we need just automatically, which is quite nice. Even in the old versions, the further we go back, the more we need to do. But right now, it actually gets easier and easier just to cluster. Because if you enable cluster link, which is a Liferay component, then you automatically cluster Liferay's message bus, and you enable, if you don't do anything else, multicast networking, where all of the instances that you're running discover each other through multicast. Now, a little bit later in here, if you say multicast, oh my God, I don't want that, this is bad, I don't have multicast enabled in my network, then yes, you can also configure Unicast, but there you actually need to configure which server is allowed to talk to which other server, and you'll need to make them aware of each other manually. Multicast is just your automatic discovery of everything, where you don't need to do anything on top of that. So with cluster link, they discover each other. The message bus will know that several messages within Liferay are handled, can be distributed in the cluster, or should only be handled on a master node in there, and the messages will be properly scheduled. And as I told you, the default is multicast networking, and you may want to pay attention to it if you're running in a data center somewhere outside of a single specific Docker network that you have configured. Because once you run in a data center between different machines, you actually don't want your production machines to discover your test machines, which happen to be on the same network, and then invalidate each other's cache. As far as I'm concerned, I don't expect bad things to happen other than your cache being invalidated, and you need to load more from the database than necessary. But it might actually interfere with some of the message handling with the message bus. So if something is weird, multicast might need to be configured as well. So we'll have the proper multicast registration. You'll find a lot more about multicast in your written material as well as on the slide, but I don't want to explain multicast for too long. It's just important to know this is what Liferay uses by default. Now the big question is, if it uses this by default, what's the magic switch to switch on cluster link? How many steps do you need? Well, here's the solution. It is a Portal X properties, so it's quite central to Liferay. It actually is required right in the beginning, and it's a portal property. It's called cluster.link.enabled equals true. Magic. No rocket surgery. So any node that you start this way will try to figure out who else is there. They actually reach out, well, somebody here, somebody there, yeah, and they find each other, and everything is fine. If you bring up a new node, 2, node 2, node 3, node 4. They will still find each other and everything is nice. If you then really need to configure multicast, for example, to set a multicast address for your production network or your test network or your QA network, then you can do that as well, also in portal properties. And of course, you don't configure in portal properties, but you override in portal ext properties. So far, no surprise. Just hammering it in. What do you need to test there, to change there? This is laid out on this slide. And if you know multicast, you know that, you gotta choose a network, you gotta choose a port, an address, basically multicast address, multicast port. And this needs to be the same over all machines in the same multicast network. So basically do the same value for every production network, do a different value for all of your test networks. And there, we're done. You can configure more. There's cluster link channels. To be honest, I have never done that. I've never needed it. All I needed is the standard option cluster.link.enabled equals true. But you have a lot more fine-grained control, which you need when you run multiple Liferays, multiple Liferay installations in the same network. Okay, the Liferay cache actually has multiple layers and you can configure it as well. This is about clustering, not about configuring the cache, because everything that we have in here runs automatically through cluster link. With cluster link, it happens automatically. Let's say I'll take two user objects, user ID 42, on two servers, server 1, server 2. You change this, and both servers have this user in their cache in memory. Now, what many people expect, what happens is you change this user object on server 1, and the cache gets somehow replicated. What would you expect to the user object on server 2? There's two options. It will either be updated to the new values, or it will be discarded. So the standard behavior is it will be discarded from cache because we might not need it anytime anymore. So we'll just discard it from cache. Server 2 doesn't know about object 42 anymore. Now there's another request coming in asking for object 42. It's been fetched again from the database and thus it's now current because the changed object has been written to the database and then we get it back from the database and everything is fine. That's what we mean with cache replication. Is not actually replication of the data. It's just the information. Something has been changed, discarded, get a new one when you need it, if you need it. Then we have two layers of caches. One is a persistence layer cache, which basically caches everything we have in the database. And one is a business layer cache. Or we have different names. One is a so-called single VM cache, and one is a multi-VM cache. What does that mean? Well, we have certain data that just is required on a single machine anyways. External RSS feeds, the weather for a certain region. We don't need that to be distributed across the cache because it's been fetched from an external server anyways. So if we look for the weather in Paris on server 1, and a minute later, we look for the weather in Paris on server number 2. Server number 2 will just go out to the external weather service and fetch the weather, and most likely it won't differ so much. Same thing for RSS feeds. An external blog might be good for 5 minutes, and they might be out of sync. Server 1 might serve different content than server 2, but after 5 minutes, everything is fine, and that's what we have in the single VM cache. The multi-VM cache is always cluster-wide, and that's exactly what I've just demonstrated with object number 42 with that user. Now, overriding cache settings, I said you can configure it, and there's a portal property for that. With this, you need to restart, which is unfortunate, but it's actually really low level to configure all of those caches. And the cache configuration is done in two files. that you find on Liferay's class path, that is Liferay single VM XML and Liferay multi-VM clustered.xml. This contains setting as how many users would you like to be cached? How many message board messages would you like to be cached? How many blog articles would you like to be cached? And this is something where you can tune your portal. Nothing that we do in terms of clustering, but that you might want to know in terms of performance management. You can set the clusters, set the caches to 0 or to high, 100, 1,000, 10,000, 100,000 per object class. So if you have lots of users coming in, you might want to cache more. If you have a very fast database, you want to cache less. So you can override this configuration by just configuring a different location. You'll need to provide the new file, but you will also need to provide the new location for that file in these settings. That's a sidetrack because we don't really need that in clustering right now. If you are on 7.1, and I believe, if I'm not mistaken, even on DXP 7.0, clustering the scheduler is done for you. You don't need to do anything else. If you're on an older version, and this is why we still have it here to remind me of this, you will need to specifically configure clustering for our engine, which is the scheduling engine Quartz. You will need to configure it explicitly. What does this mean? Our scheduling engine needs to have an idea that it is running in a cluster so that it runs each job on just one machine, because that's sufficient. You don't need to run every job on every machine because they all share the database anyways. But now, finally, by default, it's clustered. I've been waiting for that for years. It is now. Problem solved. Done. Next slide. However, the next slide says, enabling cluster awareness for a scheduler. Actually, let me go back here. That is, you actually don't really need to do it, because when cluster-link is available and when cluster-link is enabled, it will take care of this, period. Unless you're on 6.2, then you might need to do something else, but then I'd like to point you to the documentation. Configuration for Unicast. This is something, well, I rather want you to go quickly into the configuration of the cluster. So configuration for Unicast, I'll give you the reason why you want to do it, but how you do it, I actually like you to read through the material yourself, because it will be so much information and we really want to go to the cluster. And to be honest, in our Docker machine that we have in here, in this Docker network, multicast is enabled. Yay, we can go the simple route. Well, this is what we have. If your policy completely disables multicast, configuring for Unicast is what you need. You will basically make sure that every node knows of every other node. You do configure where they find each other. And there are various options here that you then can use. We'll also point you to the documentation for all of this clustering if you can't go the very simple route, if you need to have a more complex route, how to discover all of the other machines. You can configure a JDBC ping so that the machines find each other through some entry in the database. But for now, let's go the very easy route. Because the next slide in here is actually enabling portal clustering. So we will have a second Tomcat now. We'll update portal ext properties. We'll update our Docker settings, build the updated images. Those are 2. So we will enable Liferay Tomcat 2 right now in this interface. Start the service containers. And that is when your HA proxy will work, because it now finally can find Liferay Tomcat 1 and Liferay Tomcat 2. Quick review before I let you in there. There's one component that provides communication between cluster nodes, cluster link. Cluster.link.enabled equals true. It takes care of, well, here it says of 2 technologies. I would actually like to correct that for the next version to 3. Liferay's message bus is number 1. Multicast networking, yes, it just tries to distribute or tries to find each other. And the third one, which is not in here, which we'll have quickly in the material or soon, scheduling. Correct. Okay. The next ones, we have two different caches, the single VM and the multi-VM. The one needs to be distributed, the other one doesn't need to be distributed. With that, enable cluster, enable Liferay Tomcat 2. This will impose a little bit more load on your network, on your notebook, because you are now starting two Liferays, potentially at the same time. I'll leave that to you if you start one or both. And then I'll see you again in a bit in the next chapter. Ready, set, go.